In 1882, a funeral was held for a little girl named Martha Winslow until the child walked through the front door. Every person in attendance swore on their lives that what they saw that day should have been impossible. The girl they had buried had come home. But to understand what truly happened in the town of Coldwater Ridge, we must return to the days before Martha's death, before the tragedy, before the confusion, and before the whispers that something had been deeply wrong with the child long before she was ever declared dead. Coldwater Ridge, nestled deep within the blizzards of northern Maine, had always been a quiet town, a place where winters were long, summers short, and secrets buried under snow thicker than memory. The Winslow family had lived there for generations, occupying a creaking wooden house on the far edge of the ridge, close to the frozen marshlands locals call the Stillwater.
Martha Winslow was 8 years old when the story began, small, pale, and soft-spoken, with a thoughtful stare that made adults uneasy. Some said she was simply shy, others said she was observant, but a few whispered that the girl saw things other children didn't, things no child should ever see.
The first incident occurred in early February, when Martha began waking her parents in the middle of the night. She would stand silently at their doorway, trembling, and when her mother asked what was wrong, the girl would answer with the same chilling phrase each time. "They're calling me again." Her father, Jonathan Winslow, believed it was nothing more than nightmares. The winters were harsh, the nights endless, and children's imaginations were prone to wander. But Martha insisted it wasn't imagination. She said she heard voices near the marsh, voices that sounded like her own. Soon after, she stopped going outside. She refused to walk past the back door, refused to sleep near the windows, and begged her mother to keep the curtains closed, even during daylight. When questioned, she said, "If they see me, they'll take me back." No one understood what she meant. At least, not then. By late February, Martha's condition worsened. She became withdrawn, then feverish, then strangely lucid, as if oscillating between exhaustion and a clarity far too mature for her age. Her mother described her as a child trying to hold on to something slipping away. The doctor who examined her found no physical illness, no infection, no injury, nothing. But he noted one disturbing detail in his report. The girl reacts as though she hears sounds that are not present. She looks toward corners of the room where no stimulus exists. Pulse is irregular, as if startled by unseen forces. Within a week, Martha stopped speaking entirely. And then came the snowstorm. On March 3rd, a blizzard swept across Coldwater Ridge, burying the town in white silence. The winds were strong enough to shake houses, peel shingles, and extinguish every lantern along the main road. It was on that night that Martha Winslow vanished. Her mother found her window open, snow drifting across the floorboards, small footprints leading out into the storm. Search parties combed the marsh, the forests, and the frozen riverbanks through the night and into the next day. But Martha was gone. When her body was finally discovered, it was lying at the base of an old birch tree near the marsh, frozen still and dusted with snow. The coroner determined she had died of exposure. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of attack. It seemed she had simply wandered off into the storm and succumbed to the cold. The funeral was held 2 days later, on March 6th, in a small chapel overlooking the ridge. The coffin was closed, standard practice for frostbite victims, but the grieving parents insisted that Martha looked peaceful when they found her, almost as if she had simply fallen asleep. Dozens of neighbors attended the service. There were prayers, hymns, and final goodbyes whispered into the cold wooden box that held their lost child. The family returned home afterward, broken but resigned to the tragedy. And that is when everything changed. Just after dusk, as the family gathered in their dimly lit parlor, a soft knock echoed at the front door. 3 slow taps. Jonathan rose to answer it. assuming it was a neighbor bringing condolences, until he saw the small shadow beneath the doorframe. He opened it and froze. There, standing in the doorway, was Martha Winslow, alive, breathing, snow tangled in her hair. Her eyes, wide and dark, stared up at him with a quiet intensity that made his knees buckle. Her clothes were the same ones she had been found in, torn, soaked, and stiff with frost. Her skin was cold to the touch, but her lips were a faint, living pink. Her mother screamed out of shock, out of joy, out of sheer terror. Martha stepped inside without a word, walked to the center of the room, and sat down on the wooden floor as though nothing unusual had happened. When asked where she had been, she whispered, "I came back because you buried the wrong one." Those words marked the beginning of the longest and strangest 8 days in Coldwater Ridge's history. Doctors were summoned, priests consulted, neighbors whispered in panic. Martha was medically examined again, her pulse normal, her breathing steady, her eyes alert. She bore no signs of frostbite, no signs of death, no signs that she had ever lain in a frozen marsh for more than a minute. Yet her behavior was not that of the child they had known. She no longer responded to her name. She no longer slept. She no longer blinked unless she remembered to. And on 2 separate nights, Jonathan Winslow awoke to find her standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him without expression, whispering words he could not fully make out. Words that sounded eerily familiar to something she had said before she died. "They want me to switch places again." Neighbors began to avoid the house. The town pastor refused to enter it. The doctor insisted that Martha be taken to a larger city for observation, but each attempt to move her was met with violent resistance, not from Martha, but from the environment itself. Twice, the carriage meant to transport her overturned before reaching the edge of town. Horses panicked when she approached. Lanterns dimmed when she walked by. And the family's house grew colder and colder each passing night, as though the winter itself was trying to reclaim her. 8 days after her return, Martha disappeared again. This time, she did not wander into a snowstorm. She did not leave footprints. She did not open a window or a door. She simply vanished. All that remained was a single line carved into the wood of her bedroom wall. "I wasn't supposed to come back." The body buried in the cemetery was exhumed weeks later, only to reveal that the coffin was empty. No one in Coldwater Ridge could explain what they had witnessed. No theory, medical, spiritual, or supernatural, fit the facts. Some believed the child had never died. Others believed she never lived. What is certain is that the Winslow case was swiftly sealed by state authorities, filed under irregular circumstances, and locked away from public access for over a century. Tonight, we reopen that file. And what you are about to hear may finally reveal the truth behind the girl who returned from her own funeral. When state officials arrived in Coldwater Ridge in April of 1882, they did not come as investigators. They came as silencers. 2 men in dark coats arrived by train, carrying sealed documents and an authority that did not invite questions. They interviewed the Winslow family separately, confiscated personal journals, removed church records, and instructed the town pastor to revise burial logs from the previous month. By the end of the week, Martha Winslow officially no longer existed. Her birth record was amended, her death certificate voided, her name struck from town census rolls. To the outside world, the incident became a simple clerical error, a misidentified body, a panicked town, nothing more. But that explanation collapsed under even the smallest scrutiny, because the child buried in Martha's grave had never been identified, and the girl who returned had memories Martha should never have had. In the days between her return and final disappearance, Martha spoke very little, but when she did, her words were specific, precise, disturbingly detailed. She described places no child from Coldwater Ridge could have known. She spoke of a stone building beneath running water, of corridors without doors, of rooms where people whispered without mouths, and she spoke of another girl, not a ghost, not an imaginary friend, another Martha. According to her mother's testimony, recorded privately before the state sealed the case, Martha once said, "She stayed when I left." That was the rule. When pressed, the girl explained that there were two paths beneath the marsh. One led back, one did not. She said she had taken the wrong one. That statement alone haunted her mother for the rest of her life, but it was not the most disturbing detail. That came when the Winslows examined Martha's hands. The skin was smooth, too smooth. No scars, no childhood marks. A small crescent-shaped scar Martha had received at age 4 from falling on a nail behind the house was gone, completely absent, as if the body standing before them had been reconstructed rather than revived. Her teeth, too, were different. One that had chipped months earlier was intact. It was Martha, but not exactly. And then there was the matter of the voice. Multiple witnesses reported that when Martha spoke after returning, her voice did not echo the way it used to. It sounded closer, flatter, as though it came from inside the listener's head rather than from her mouth. One neighbor described it as a sound you didn't hear so much as receive. Children were the most affected. Within hours of Martha's return, several children in town began waking from sleep screaming. They claimed to see her standing at the foot of their bed silent, watching. But when parents rushed in, no one was there. And yet, footprints appeared in frost-covered floors. 3 days after Martha came home, the Wilkes boy aged 7 disappeared. His bedroom window was sealed shut from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. He was never found. 2 days later, another child vanished. Then another. The disappearances followed a pattern. Each child had spoken to Martha. Each had claimed she asked them the same question. Do you want to switch? By the time officials realized what was happening, it was already too late. The marsh began to thaw. When the snow melted, searchers found something beneath the ice that stopped them cold. Carved into the frozen mud were simple shapes forming repeating patterns. Circles inside squares. Lines folded back onto themselves. Not random marks, but deliberate designs. And at the center of it all, 2 sets of footprints. One small, one smaller. Only one set ever left the marsh. The state's final report, recovered decades later through a partial archive leak, ends abruptly. The last readable paragraph states, "The subject demonstrates traits inconsistent with biological continuity. Evidence suggests displacement rather than resurrection. Further observation deemed inadvisable." No explanation follows. No conclusion. Just silence. After Martha's final disappearance, Coldwater Ridge changed. Winters grew harsher. Children stopped playing near the marsh. The Winslow house was abandoned and eventually collapsed into itself. Jonathan Winslow died in 1891, never speaking publicly about what he had seen. His wife lived until 1910, and in her final journal entry, she wrote only one sentence. She didn't come back wrong. She came back unfinished. Today, the marsh is gone, drained and paved over in the early 20th century. Coldwater Ridge exists only as a footnote in county records. But once every few years, something strange still happens. A child is found wandering alone. No identification. No missing persons report. No memory of where they came from. And when asked their name, they hesitate, as if choosing the right one. For decades, the Winslow case was treated as a regional myth. Local historians dismissed it as grief-induced hysteria. Psychologists cited mass suggestion. Clergy blamed superstition fueled by isolation and harsh winters. And on paper, the official explanation remained simple. A child was misidentified. Panic followed. Tragedy compounded tragedy. But those explanations begin to collapse when you examine what happened after the state closed the file. Because Martha Winslow was not the last child to return. Between 1882 and 1904, at least 7 similar cases were quietly documented across rural England and Scotland. All involved children, all involved funerals, and all shared details so specific that coincidence becomes impossible. In each case, the child was declared dead. In each case, the body was buried. And in each case, the child reappeared days later. Not revived, not rescued. Returned. The most detailed of these occurred in 1897 in a village nearly 200 miles from Coldwater Ridge. A girl named Eleanor Pike was pronounced dead after a fever. Her funeral was held at dawn, as was customary during outbreaks. The ground was still frozen. The burial was shallow. 3 days later, Eleanor walked into her family's kitchen. Her mother fainted on the spot. But what terrified the villagers was not Eleanor's appearance, it was her behavior. She refused to sleep in her own bed. She would not cross running water, and she insisted on keeping every door open, even in winter. When asked why, she answered with the same words Martha Winslow had used 15 years earlier. Close things don't let you choose. When Eleanor was examined by a physician, he noted something unsettling. Her pulse was slow, unnaturally so. Her body temperature was slightly below normal. And when he placed his ear to her chest, he described her heartbeat as irregular, as though waiting for something else to finish first. But the most chilling similarity came 1 week later. A neighbor's child vanished. Then another. The pattern repeated itself. Every time one of the returned children appeared, other children disappeared. Always quietly. Always without signs of struggle. Always after speaking to the returned child. In every case, officials intervened. Records vanished. Families were paid. Villages were warned. And then, in 1904, the cases stopped. Or rather, they became harder to recognize. That year, a sealed memorandum circulated among several regional authorities. Only fragments survive, but one passage remains legible. Further containment requires reframing. Do not treat events as isolated incidents. Treat them as exchanges. Exchanges. That word appears again and again in the margins of recovered documents. Not resurrection, not survival. Exchange. According to one unnamed analyst, the phenomenon followed a rule. Something returned only when something else stayed behind. The idea was never made public, but it explains details that were otherwise impossible. Why the returned children lacked scars. Why their memories included places they'd never been. Why their voices sounded wrong. Why they seemed incomplete. And why they were never the same child who was buried. In Martha Winslow's case, this theory becomes especially disturbing because the girl buried in her grave was never identified. Her coffin was opened only once during an unauthorized exhumation conducted years later by a local historian. What he found was not recorded officially, but in a letter sent to a colleague, he wrote, "The remains do not match any known child from the region. The bone structure is inconsistent, and there are signs of prolonged pressure, as if the body had been folded into itself." The letter ends abruptly. The historian died 2 months later in what was ruled an accident, but the implications remain. If the body buried as Martha Winslow was not Martha, then who was it? And more importantly, where did it come from? One theory, quietly circulated among early 20th century researchers, suggested that these exchanges did not occur between the living and the dead, but between parallel versions of the same child. Not timelines, not dimensions, but states. A place where children exist differently, where identity is fluid, where names are temporary, a place connected not by death, but by grief. Every recorded exchange followed a moment of extreme emotional collapse, a family overwhelmed by loss, a community fractured by fear, a child caught between attention and abandonment. In those moments, something opens. Not a door, not a portal, a gap. And children, with their incomplete sense of self, are uniquely vulnerable to it. They slip, and sometimes they come back, but never alone. Which brings us back to Martha Winslow's final disappearance. On the last night she was seen, a storm swept through Coldwater Ridge. Rain fell so heavily that the marsh overflowed, swallowing the path that led to the old church. According to the one surviving witness, a farmhand returning late, he saw a small figure standing at the edge of the water. But he also saw another, two children, facing each other. One stepped forward, the other stepped back. And then there was only one. The next morning, Martha Winslow was gone forever. No body was ever found. But the grave behind the church was no longer empty. It contained a second set of remains, smaller than before, and folded in a way no human body should be. Officially, the Martha Winslow case was closed in 1882. No charges, no conclusions, no further investigation. The records list her as deceased. Yet her name appears faintly, inconsistently, in census drafts years later. Not as a resident, not as a survivor, but as a correction, a footnote, a mistake someone tried to undo. Today, the church behind Coldwater Ridge no longer stands. The graveyard was cleared. The land was sold. Nothing remains except one unmarked plot that was never relocated. Locals still avoid that corner because sometimes, after heavy rain, footprints appear near where the grave once was. Small, bare, leading away from the ground and stopping suddenly, as if the child remembered something or someone. Perhaps Martha Winslow did return from her funeral, but if she did, the real question is, who stayed behind?